AI, work, well-being, and what's next, a conversation with thought leaders. We're joined today by three distinguished experts who bring unique perspectives on the future of work and the role of artificial intelligence. Kevin Bryan is Associate Professor of Strategic Management at the University of Toronto. He is also co-founder of the AI EdTech company, All Day TA, and has editorial and research positions with leading journals and institutions worldwide. His research applies to economic history, game theory, and empirical data to study how innovation, and especially AI, is created, adopted, and regulated. Scott Sheeman is a professor of sociology and Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto. He's in the middle. Brian's right beside me. Over the past 2 decades, his surveys of more than 50,000 workers in Canada and the United States have shed light on how people think and feel about work and how job quality, workplace culture shape identity, well-being, and status over time. Arif Jetha is the Associate Scientific Director of the Institute for Work and Health and Associate Professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, University of Toronto. He leads a federally funded partnership, congratulations on that again, Arif, and the quality of work, examining how technology affects worker health, safety, and equity. His work bridges research and practice to ensure AI is implemented responsibly and humanly. So to start our conversation today, I am pleased to welcome Kevin up, followed by remarks from Scott, and then Arif. Following that, the three panelists will take questions from the room or people online. If we don't get through all the questions, we'll make sure that we're able to connect back with you post the AGM. So, based on that, we want to make sure online gets an opportunity to ask questions as well as people in the room. So I will pass it over to Kevin. Kevin?
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn. So I think what we're going to do here is we're going to take this from the most out there AI ideas all the way down to the most practical ones. And the reason I say that is that I think this has been all of our experience. So, when we're out in California at an AI lab, everything sounds like science fiction and they think we're too slow. When I give talks to institutions, and not just kind of governmental or quasi-governmental, but even the big banks down the street, the adoption of AI is way, way slower than what the folks in California think is going on. And so essentially our job is to find out what AI can do usefully, not just today, but say like 5-10 years from now, and why organizations might not get a benefit from that despite the technical achievements, okay? So start with what AI can do. So you should think of any AI model as a prediction tool, okay? I'm gonna take some data, I'm gonna make some prediction. If you've seen like a regression, that's a very, very simple model. These AI models are much more complex. The reason people think are particularly excited about AI over the past few years is that the predictions we've been making, particularly with large language models or other models called transformers, like the video model you saw up there, they don't feel like what you would think of as a prediction. So a large language model is taking essentially all the words on the internet as a first approximation, and it's going to use that to predict next words. There's a little bit of detail in between. How could that matter? Well, it turns out that if I were to say, the sun ... you might say rises or is, or there's some distribution of words. And if I were to say, let's talk about our, classic books, and I said the sun, you might say also. Hopefully you know why. And so that prediction task turns out to be very useful for generating models that can basically create rules. So it can understand the thought process in a very similar way to how humans act. So it's allowed us to do a broader set of tasks than we were able to do with models like a regression. And so these prediction tools have allowed us to do things like literally drive cars down the street in a way that reduces auto accidents by 85 to 90% is what it looks like in the data. And honestly, that's an underestimate. That's conditional on the other cars being driven by humans on the road, okay? So from a public safety perspective, like, does it seem like the 1.2 million people dying in car crashes that this is a prediction task? Well, think about it. I'm driving down the street. Should I turn left? Should I turn right? Should I stop? Based on all the evidence in front of me? That's a prediction task. I'm taking in the video. I'm trying to figure out what I should do. And maybe I'm adding additional context to make the prediction. Maybe I have a LiDAR or a radar on top of the car. Maybe I'm able to see beside me or behind me in a way that a human can't do in order to make that prediction, okay? So AI as a prediction task has gotten very, very, very good. And I would say the models have improved really over the past 3 years. So ChatGPT came out in November 2022, November 30th, 2022. In between then and now, in kind of expert panels trying to predict what tasks AI can do, actually AI's improved more quickly than we thought. I'm one of the people on these panels, so I was wrong also, okay? Like, I mean, how good have they gotten? You know, for a mathematician, you know, I basically have a PhD in applied mathematics. There are no longer problems that I can solve that the frontier AI models can't prove, okay? For people writing code in computer code in top labs, you know, the vast majority of code is written for the first time by AI. And for technical tasks like, say, various types of medical prediction, even if they're not integrated yet, the prediction task AI has gotten incredibly good at, like to the point where I would be a little bit skeptical of seeing a doctor who did not use AI to help with diagnosis now. I don't mean 5 years from now. And 5 years from now, this is the part that I think people worry sounds like science fiction, so please just, bear with me. I would say I would be surprised if 99% of human prediction tasks can't be done with frontier models. And those prediction tasks are not just things done in a computer. The models are going to code the next version of the models, which are going to help us understand how to improve robotics in a way we can't currently do, which is going to allow robots to be developed more quickly than they've been previously, okay? So that's the world we're going to be in. Now, that's technical. In practice, you're not going to see that benefit. So in practice, the problem is how any new technology is adopted when we look historically at everything from electricity to mechanization to computers. Something like 4 to 5 decades to reach 50% adoption in an industry would not be surprising. So in electricity, 1882, we have the Edison centralized electricity in New York. By 1922, only half of US manufacturing is electrified. So how do I square these, okay? So basically what every organization does with a new technology is first they take tasks that people currently do and they try to do those tasks more efficiently or at lower costs. Tasks I do by myself. So like maybe I'm writing an email and I can't think of the right way to word this, so I ask GPT or ask something like that. Okay? Or I'm making my slides, I want to make them a little prettier, I ask a model. That's easy. Generally, that's adopted pretty quick. It's just a matter of training your workers or even letting them experiment. Harder is a team needs to adopt something. So if I want to use an AI tool to, say, write slides, and the tool I'm using is not PowerPoint, then I need the other people working on this deck with me to use the same thing that I use. So what you need there is you need essentially the boss to come down and say, we're doing it this way. But that adoption's already gotten slow. I think most organizations can pull it off. When I look at kind of at the Canadian organizations I talk to, most of the big ones have kind of gotten to that point. The next two, though, are the ones where you actually get a productivity benefit. So the third one is I'm doing something new, something my organization did not previously do that is now worth doing because of AI that requires me to make what we call architectural changes to the organization. So I say architectural because to move this table from here over toward the lectern, we just pick it up and move it. If I need another 5 foot of space in this room and I have to push that wall out, you see there's like a lot of costs that are going to be incurred. It's not so easy. Organizations have these architectural features like what skills are in upper management? How is information communicated? What type of, what gets you promoted in your organization? Like what do you think your boss wants you to do? That kind of stuff is very difficult to change. And so, if you think like a big architectural adoption, going back to electricity, originally we would take the machine that was connected to a steam engine or a water wheel, had some belts bringing electricity to the machine. We just take the belts down and plug the machine in the wall. I save a little bit of money, but it's not a huge change. The huge change is because I don't need that steam engine and I don't need the belt system and I don't have to be near water. I can move the factory out to the suburbs. Because I'm not running the belts up and down the factory, I can turn the factory sideways. Once I turn the factory sideways, I can set up an assembly line. So now I'm getting a productivity benefit. I'm not just saving the money on the electricity from where it's plugged in. I'm actually doing a task I couldn't do previously. That is very hard, needs a lot of, basically management needs to make choices to not do things we did previously or to make some people upset. Okay, that's why it's hard. That's pretty good. The really big productivity benefit is going to be do the same thing, things involving architectural changes that are outside your control. Regulations need to change, okay? Or the how you work with your vendors or your partners need to change. That's really hard. So my favorite example of this is radiology, reading scans, okay? Jeff Hinton, at one of our events actually that we hosted in 2016, way before he won the Nobel Prize, this guy basically invents deep learning at University of Toronto, and he said, stop training radiologists, there's no point. Okay? Radiologists in 2025, actually in the US, the number of residency spots for radiologists is at an all-time high this year, and the average salary, I probably shouldn't tell you guys this, but the average salary for a radiologist in the US is about 700,000 Canadian dollars. So, would have not been a great idea in 2016 to have not gone to school to study radiology. That said, the prediction Jeff made, the reading of the scans, it is in fact true that for almost all scans, the AI can identify anomalies better than a human can. But I need to integrate that scan reading into the work process in the hospital. So I need to procure software. I need to change maybe certain privacy laws that I was using before that I didn't worry about because I wasn't sending these type of scans out. I need to change, how do I communicate the results of the scan? I still need someone to communicate it. So if I don't need the $700,000 radiologist, maybe I'm hiring a different type of person to do that task. Maybe I hire doctors who have really good bedside manner that are not as good at diagnostics. If I want to do that, I don't have a choice. I can hire the people with MDs. I can't change the balance of diagnostics versus bedside manner. Okay, so that starts to get very, very difficult, and those last two types of adoptions, architectural changes internally and externally, you'll see like decades-long delays before you get the really big productivity benefit. So what does that mean for a PSA? What that means is that in order for you guys to be the leader in your field, you need to figure out what use cases are there for prediction tasks, assuming that the prediction tasks are just going to get better. They will get better than today. Next year will be better. The year after will be better. What can I use them for that I don't currently do? And if in order to use that, what architectural changes do I need to make to my organization? Or what regulations do I need to push the government to change when I partner with them or other partners? If I can do that, then I can adopt this stuff really quick. If not, we're going to see videos in 5 years where people are making basically Hollywood films with a little bit of context and a little bit of prompting, and we're still doing the same stuff exactly the same in our organization and not getting the same kind of benefits in our organization. Okay, on that note, we've got 2 more great speakers, so I'm going to pause. We'll come back for questions afterward. Thanks.
Okay, so my name's Scott Sheeman, and as Glenn said, I'm a sociologist who studies what people think and feel and how they talk about work. So in a way, I'm sort of like, how are you feeling after hearing that we're all doomed? No, I'm kidding.
So you should feel really excited is what I'm trying to say.
So, yeah.
Not doomed, excited.
But, so that's what I'm gonna offer today is more of, so for about 20 years, I've been studying, started in the US and then moved to Canada, studying large nationally representative surveys of Americans and Canadians. So broad cross-section designed to be carefully representative across the workforce, across the occupational spectrum. In those surveys, basically studying mostly basically I'm interested in why your job still matters. What happens when work vanishes or changes in a fundamental way? Like going from the office 5 days a week to fully remote or partially remote or something. What happens? And of course, there's millions and millions of variations on that, but I've been trying to dissect and distill the essence of that. In the process of doing the surveys, I'm just giving you some context here. So that's the broad quantitative portrait. Within the surveys, I've done a design where I do sort of open-ended follow-up, what I call free text, which allows people, free text or talking, which, you know, you say, I feel it's very likely that most of the things that I do on my job were going to be replaced. And so then I would follow up, can you say a little bit more about that? And that's the gold. Those are the stories and the richness. And so you've got the top level quantitative part, and then you've got the more qualitative part. But then I've also done in-depth interviews with people. So back in 2020, when March of 2020, when the world was basically changing dramatically, I was in the field studying people who were temporarily laid off. I'm using quotes because a lot of people on Friday, March 13th of 2020 were told, we're on pause, nobody knows what's gonna happen, and you're on furlough or temporarily laid off. And millions of people entered a state of limbo. And I asked most of them, how did you feel about that before? And my job was secure. So again, an unexpected, rapid change. I mean, this one's gonna be different, we can talk about that, but same sort of thing where there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of structural changes. So I talked to those people in depth. The other group was, I noticed in my data, a lot of people were like, I'm done, I'm retiring early. So work ended earlier for them than they expected, and I wanted to know, how did that affect them? People in their 50s, especially in healthcare and other high pressure, they're like, okay, I was gonna do this for another 5 years, I don't need to, I'm out. But work left, they left work before they expected. The third group were people who were working in an office and then suddenly were remote. And I was really interested in my data. People just kept saying, pivot, pivot, we had to pivot, we had to pivot. People were like, I'm triggered, I can't hear that word anymore, I'm triggered by that word, pivot. So again, as a sociologist, I also study stress and health, and so this is where we'll piggyback off each other maybe, but work takes up a fundamental part of our lives, for our lives, like a third of our lives. And so when something so fundamental is rocked, and we don't feel a sense of control over it, powerlessness goes up, what happens to people? So that's sort of where I'm coming from, is sort of for about 20 years, almost like a massive ongoing Canada-US, which is also interesting on its own, kind of almost one long-running focus group with millions of people. So that's where I'm coming from on this. And again, my fundamental interest is in what happens when work fundamentally changes or vanishes. So hopefully you can see this, a little small, sorry. I'm gonna present a couple data points for you today just to show you what I've been doing, and it's more about what do Canadians and Americans think and feel about this idea of automation. And the other thing that I do is I'm interested in historical snapshots. So I go back 50 years to some of the classic surveys, especially in the United States, to look at quality of working life. And so I use those as benchmarks, and I've actually excavated a lot of those survey items that have disappeared, some great ones on friendships, which are fascinating. Just so essential, but like mostly disappeared from surveys. I brought them back and fielded them, and 50 years later, you can look at wow, things look almost identical. As much as all of this stuff has changed, the way people think and report it, at least on surveys, looks almost identical. So one of the questions that I excavated, I don't know if you can see this here, the bar on the far left there is from the 1973 classic Quality of Employment Survey. In the 70s in the United States, there was a massive interest in understanding how blue-collar jobs were going to be affected by automation. So this question, which is how likely is it in the next few years machines or computers will be doing a lot of the things that you do now on your job? And so what were those in the 70s, right? I mean, well, in the 80s, I was programming on my Commodore 64, like putting together French tests for myself. But it's changed so dramatically. So 50 years later, I excavated that and put it in the surveys in the US. So I have a couple of data points here, but I have a lot more. So basically, since about 2023, we saw this in 2022. In 2023, we brought this back up and started asking it. And you can see here, back then, 69% of American workers said not at all likely that machines or computers would be doing a lot of the work. So the recent survey that's on the far right here, the 2025, just happened. We just fielded that from September 8th to the 18th. So that's fresh data. And actually, there are a few data points in there. Canadian attitudes about this aren't really changing. This is top level, top line. So you could go in and say, well, it's higher for people in certain sectors or education levels. But you can sort of see the breakdown there. And in fact, on a lot of things, what's interesting is attitudes are also very slow to change. There's a lagged effect, especially when you get into the qualitative. So I'm not going to have time to do that in my brief talk, but there's a lot of qualitative data packed into these questions. So then we ask a follow-up of the people who say it's at least a little likely. If this automation of your job happens, which is the most likely outcome? And you can see here, again, this was the way it was asked in the 70s, so we had to replicate the exact wording. And again, in our most recent survey, 22% in Canada say out of a job, 22% say assigned other tasks, 36% say job would be adapted, 5% say something else, and 14% say they can't choose or they're not sure. So there's still a lot of uncertainty here. Again, broad, top level, you can do a deeper dive into what's going on here. So the other thing that I'm interested in is broad cultural narratives about work and how the media portrays some of the narratives. And that really came out of especially the Great Resignation and some of the stuff that I was seeing. The anti-work rhetoric in the 2021, 2022, I was noticing work's reputation was taking a real hit, and I was worried about that. And so I've written a book, basically it's a defense and sort of a defense and celebration of the work ethic. And we should be careful about how anti-work we are, because if it disappears, my argument is we're gonna need something to replace that, and universal basic income's not gonna do it. We're gonna need something. Not everybody, some people are like, show me the money, I'm fine, just give me the money. But a lot of people feel differently. Anyway, we fielded this survey question, and this comes from Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, was interviewed in May by Van de Heye and Allen at Axios. I don't know if you've seen this, but it caused quite a stir. And he made the claim, quote, AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. That's a quote directly from the piece. So we put it in the survey and asked people, what do you think? Some people got very angry, like, thank you, just ruined my day. I'm now depressed. But you can see here, like 15% say very likely, 48% say somewhat likely, 31% a little likely, 5% not at all likely. And again, there's so much rich open-ended text related to this, where it is true, I sort of feel bad because some people, if not on their radar, now this puts it on their radar, and that was the point of Amodei's. He's like, people are not paying attention. It's kind of ironic that the CEO of the AI company that's gonna display, he's basically like, you better pay attention while we replace you. It's sort of an interesting.
Don't worry, this won't happen,
Yeah.
by the way, just so we're all clear.
But okay, so that's my broader point is like so I'm also like, is it gonna it's sort of the same old story, like, and it gets people more anxious about what's really gonna happen. Or who knows, I mean, the way they're talking about it. So the other piece that I'm interested in, again, it's high level stuff in terms of, it's not maybe as practical, although loyalty in the employer-employee relationship, what people think should happen in that. It's almost like the social contract. And so many people are like, sort of like, well, I'll work 25 years for the employer and then they'll just discard me and there's no loyalty, and there's a real perception about that. So we asked this question, we presented, companies have a duty to retrain workers whose jobs are eliminated by new technology. And again, like, this sort of reciprocity belief, like what is owed, what's the, I've been putting in, are you just gonna discard me, is that it? And if that's the case, there's gonna be a lot of implications of that, we think. But you can see here, 28% strongly agree, 36% agree, and 25% are ambiguous. We added a neither agree nor disagree here. And so you can see there's quite a bit of variation in terms of what people think and feel about that. And the last thing I'll say about this is the idea that what should be human, like what part of work should be human. And so I heard earlier the word empathy came up. Like, are there, a machine or a computer doesn't have an identity. It might have an artificial identity, but we have identities. Like we have work identities, we have family, we have multiple identities. And that's actually fundamental to why people work. I am an electrician, and I've worked there for 40 years, and I'm proud of it. We should tread lightly on how much we want to mess with that. But this is really a powerful question, because you can see people kind of getting, like, talk about worker protection. What part of what I do should still remain fundamentally human? And again, a lot of this is almost blurring into personal philosophies, and that's what's fascinating. People have very rich vocabularies about these things. You just have to ask them, and that's been a powerful point for me in this research. Is some people will write at the end of the survey like, nobody's ever asked. Thank you for asking. But you can see here, there's strong sentiment about this. 55% strongly agree certain tasks in my job should always be done by humans, even if machines could do them just as well. They're going to do them better. Quick story on this, like I used to hire undergrads to help produce, we'd produce podcasts from our research. AI I could play one for you right now. It'll do it in like a couple of minutes. And it's so good. One of my colleagues sent it to me, and I thought it was real. I mean, it is real, but it's not real people. They're dialoguing about a piece of research. I used to hire undergrads, supervise, mentor, give them enriched learning experiences. I don't need to do it anymore. Should I do it is a different question, and I actually feel like we should, but it gets to what's part of the moral economy. What do we owe each other? It's more of a philosophical question. I think I'll stop there and take questions after. Thank you.
All right. Well, delighted to follow these two esteemed speakers. I'm going to provide another lens to this whole conversation, and that's the occupational health, safety, and equity lens that we ought to be kind of thinking about as we engage in this discussion on AI and what it means for workers and their well-being. So I'm based at the Institute for Work and Health, located down the street, and I'm delighted to say we're close partners with this organization, with PSHSA, and we've been on this journey discovering the role AI can play in the health, safety, and well-being of workers for the last 5 or so years. And I can say there's actually very little evidence of how workers will be affected from a health perspective. But there are signals that we're hoping to pursue, to elaborate on, and to provide an evidence base that organizations like yours can utilize as you embark on your own personal AI journeys. So at the Institute for 30 years, we've kind of spent a lot of time uncovering the role that the work environment plays for physical and psychosocial health and safety of workers in Ontario. So we know that physical conditions in the work environment, psychosocial conditions in the work environment, they all play a significant role. Our work arrangements, how much we get paid, our security at work. And it's my kind of argument that AI has the potential to fundamentally disrupt our work environment, reorganize our work environment in ways in which we're not prepared to manage from a health and safety perspective. But we ought to be taking the next step to become prepared, and I think that's what this organization is doing. So in these very brief remarks, I'm going to be discussing a little bit about the pros and cons that AI could potentially pose to workers from a health, safety, and equity perspective. I'm going to introduce a little bit of data that we've been working on at the Institute for Work and Health. And then I'll talk a little bit about the role that AI is playing in health and safety practice, because I think that's an important way to kind of round things out before we get into the Q&A. So I think both Kevin and Scott provided a very valuable perspective on the role AI is playing in our working lives. It's obviously making things more productive, it's making things more efficient, and it's shaping the way we think about work. But what does that mean for health and well-being? Well, I think on the positive end, there's a lot of potentially really important outcomes from this. One, in the past, if you think about the hierarchy of controls, we can actually remove humans from maybe the most unsafe and stressful working conditions. That has a huge potential to improve the safety of workers, and we ought to be thinking about different applications to make this happen. AI might be able to just increase the quality of our working lives, taking on the more monotonous tasks, the tasks that we just really don't want to do. I oftentimes I'll scrutinize an email for like an hour and I'll send it out, but I don't need to do that anymore. I can totally take advantage of these large language models to allow me to do that. The efficiency gains and accuracy have the potential to improve the safety and well-being of workers. But I will say we've done a number of evidence synthesis activities, and the tangible impact on injury outcomes, safety outcomes, it's unclear. The evidence is not showing that there's a direct link between using AI and health and safety outcomes. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but we just don't know. We just don't know enough, right? And so when people ask me questions like, should I be using AI to improve the health and safety of my organization? I'll say, I think it's a potential solution, but we don't know. And so I think folks thinking about utilizing it need to take a balanced approach to this. And why is a balanced approach important? Well, there's a lot of harms that can pop up, and there's a big discourse on responsible and safe AI from a societal level, but I'll bring it down to the health and safety level. The first is working alongside productive and intelligent machines will intensify work for many workers. Like I just put myself in the shoes. If I was working alongside an intelligent agent who's faster than me, probably smarter than me, can consume more data than I can, it's going to make me really stressed and going to make me potentially work harder. Maybe I might cut corners in the way I perform a task, maybe put myself in more unsafe situations. And this is going to happen maybe across a lot of different industries. It's going to reorganize the way I perform tasks. I'm now going to have to interact with this new agent at work. And am I prepared to kind of navigate this new work environment? I think it's going to change the psychosocial structure of our work environment for better or for worse. There's a lot of cases in which AI might malfunction and cause injury to a worker. Is our compensation system prepared for this these types of cases? AI designed for certain uses could be misused in certain cases, and that could create risks for workers. And then the question I keep asking myself is, who's going to benefit from these AI gains? And if we look in the past, any technological change, it's often benefited the most powerful in our labor market and disadvantaged the most vulnerable. Will that be the case in this AI revolution? Or might it bridge the gap and address inequities that have existed? Maybe now we have this tool where those who've traditionally been less powerful might be able to to leverage it to have gains in the labor market. So we don't have a lot of the answers to these questions, but there's signals and there's areas that we ought to be researching, and as a researcher, I'm very excited about that. So I'm going to show you a slide, and this is from Canada's labor force survey. So we did a study a couple years ago where we utilized methods from economists, like folks in Kevin's world, and what the economists have done have taken all the occupations that exist and have broken them down based on the cluster of job tasks that make up those occupations. And what these studies find is, and this one's focused on machine learning, which is a subset of AI technologies, and what these studies tend to tell us is that pretty much every job will have some job tasks that will be performed by AI. So no occupation is untouched by AI, but some are more exposed to AI and machine learning technologies, whereas others are less exposed, right? So we can think about a police officer potentially being less exposed to machine learning or AI because they're more variable, they're physical tasks, they're unpredictable. On a day-to-day basis, things look completely different. They're interacting with a wide range of people. But you might think about someone like a travel agent. It's a very kind of monotonous task. Someone asks you a question, you go online, you figure it out, and you can provide them with it, and it's very data-driven. That might be an example of a task that is very exposed to technologies like machine learning. So these studies continue to show us that all jobs are going to be touched by these types of technologies. But what's interesting from our perspective is that oftentimes the impact of AI on occupations is patterned according to worker characteristics and is patterned to industry and occupational characteristics. So I'll give you a couple examples to bring this to life. So in this study, we looked at gender differences in exposure to machine learning at the occupational level. And this is, again, Canadian data. And what we found was that women were more likely to work in jobs that were highly exposed to machine learning. So is this a good news story or a bad news story? I can't tell you, but there's different ways that we can look at this. One, women who've traditionally kind of been excluded from the labor market or kind of being pushed into worse quality jobs. Perhaps this is a good news story, right? All of a sudden, we have this new technology. It's highly applicable to the job that I am doing. Therefore, I can leverage it. I can utilize it to have productivity gains. I can be more efficient as a result of it. I'm going to have a better job. Or the bad news story, which is this is going to automate my job. It's going to displace me. Things are going to get worse. And so it's going to further widen that inequity. So again, we don't have enough data to kind of bring this to life, but that's what we're trying to do through some of our research at the organization. You might not be able to fully see this slide, but I'll bring it to life a bit more. So in the past, automation technologies have tended to impact workers who are working in low-skilled jobs, those that have repetitive tasks, right? So it's easy to automate those types of tasks. But with AI, potentially higher-skilled jobs might be most affected or most exposed to these types of technologies. So in this study, we looked at precarious work, which is skill level, wages, insecurity at work. And what we found was that the highest quality jobs, the least precarious, were most likely to be exposed to large language models. So what that means is the best quality jobs are also those that can be performed by large language models. Again, is this a good news story or a bad news story? If we look at past trends, what I suspect is that the best quality jobs will get even better. People will leverage these types of technologies to be more productive, to advance, to earn more money, whereas those who traditionally have been working in precarious jobs, they'll be maybe pushed to the margins. They'll be excluded from these types of innovations. Again, we don't have data to kind of elaborate on this, but this is from Canada's Labour Force Survey. It's utilizing methodologies that have been pretty validated in terms of occupational exposure to AI. Okay, so very lastly, we wanted to understand to what extent are health and safety professionals utilizing AI, and what's the relationship between AI use and health and safety, and like what differentiates a user of AI for health and safety versus a non-user. And so in this survey of about 800 health and safety professionals in Ontario and British Columbia, we asked, is your firm utilizing AI for occupational health and safety purposes? And what we found was that just about under a third of participants noted that their firms were utilizing AI for health and safety purposes. About half said, nope, we're not touching AI. We're kind of sticking to our traditional methods. And just under 20% said, I don't even know, like my workplace could be utilizing it, I just don't know. So that's kind of a telling stat that they might be actually exposed to AI and they might be utilizing it for health and safety purposes, but they just don't know. But what was interesting about this study was that if we then asked, so what extent is your organization utilizing AI for other purposes? And about half said, yeah, they're utilizing it for productivity, they're utilizing it for manufacturing, other types of functions. So there's a bit of a gap, right? So there's a gap between AI use for business benefits and AI use for occupational health benefits. So I think that's kind of an interesting finding where we ought to think about how we can apply these tools that have been well established for business purposes and bring them to improve the working lives of workers. And one thing that I thought was most interesting about this study is that what we found was that the most hazardous firms were more likely to turn to AI to support their health and safety practice. So it's like the highly sensitive, safety-sensitive organizations. They're turning to more technologies, or turning to these types of technologies to like innovate their health and safety practice. But again, that creates a gap, right? Like, are maybe the less unsafe organizations being left behind in the storyline? And I think that's one that we ought to think about. Like, obviously, we need to protect workers in the most hazardous working conditions, but we also ought to think about workplaces across the health and safety spectrum. So with that, I'm going to conclude, but I did want to highlight, and this is kind of a shameless plug, but it's relevant to this organization. We were recently funded for about 7 years to advance research in the area of AI and its impact on the health, safety, and well-being of workers. And we plan to do that through ongoing large big data analytics, through going into workplaces and observing how workers are interacting with AI tools, and what their reactions, their health and safety challenges and benefits are. And then we're also planning to observe how the evidence in this area is changing over time. This organization, PSHSA, is a partner on this research, and that's why I talk about it. But what's also interesting here is that we're bringing together the AI community, the health and safety community, labor, compensation, to kind of provide multiple perspectives to advance this area. And I think that's what's interesting about this work and why we ought to be kind of working in a collaborative nature, because health and safety independently is not going to be able to kind of bridge this knowledge gap that I'm identifying. It has to be a collaborative approach. And like Glenn is doing, we have to bring together diverse perspectives to advance knowledge in this area. So with that, I will conclude, but looking forward to the Q&A.
All right, so thanks for all that. And yes, my intent was a diversity of thought. I think we got that. That's just great. I do want to open it up to questions. I've got a few questions, but I can access these guys anytime, so I'll just leave that off. I want to make sure people online or in the room have questions for, as a group or individuals. Please take advantage of having these three guys in the room.
Okay, so I just want to do a plug for those of us who are watching the stream. If you go to the side of your screen, there's a messaging tab, and that's where you can submit questions for the panel. But we do have a question. So Arif, what you were mentioning, is this a good news story or a bad news story? And someone wants to know, do you think that negative headlines about AI and jobs seem to resonate more strongly with workers than positive ones? And how does that shape what happens inside the workplace?
Go for it, Scott.
Oh, so, was that for you though, or?
The whole
Okay.
panel, yeah.
So one of the other things that I'm interested in is, look, there's no clear causal arrow between like, okay, I see the headline, white collar bloodbath. I mean, and job apocalypse and the job market's hell. And I track that because this is what I do. And I'm seeing that and I'm kind of like, but there's no question that there is a negativity instinct. So another thread of my research actually looks at people's evaluations of their own job qualities and conditions and what they think most other people think and feel. In fact, how they think other people would answer. It's a whole other topic. I mean, I'd be happy to share more details on it. But on almost every indicator, people rate their own personal qualities much better than they do what most other people are feeling, including even it's actually attitudes towards, surprise, employers, attitudes about employers like as a greedy, they're really, really negative, but people's own personal evaluations of their own employers are actually quite positive. There's a massive disconnect. So to answer your question, I mean, I think one of the strong elements of my research is an argument that it's what gets clicks and what gets our attention are the negative stories. I mean, I say this to my class. If I said to you, like, I've got two stories, friends of mine told me two stories. One was about going through a bitter divorce, and the other was about how wonderfully loving their relationship is. Which one do you want to hear? Tell me about the divorce. And so, it's not good. It's not a good, in fact, I think it's really, really, really destructive, and a whole thread of my research is exploring this. It's in in US, Canada, almost identical. So but yeah, good question. I think the media narratives, like white collar bloodbath, that popped on my screen, and I'm like, gee, white collar bloodbath. I mean, I'm teaching 20-year-olds who are like reading these headlines, and they're like, my bigger question is, what does it do for motivation and why work?
So
Why am I sitting here at this university shelling out, why don't I just become an electrician or a plumber? In fact, I was watching a story last night. Those are the safer bets. But again, I think there's so many mixed messages. So I think actually what I'm teaching now is more how to teach students to be like savvy consumers of all of this stuff and parse out the nonsense. Anyway.
Yeah, I think, so a problem is that for the reputation, the industry that's had a white-collar bloodbath is journalism. And journalism had a white-collar bloodbath because of technological changes. So it's like not surprising to me that this particular industry is fairly hostile to. But, when I talk to government, I always end my talks by showing a picture of a car factory, tons of robots, two people in the far distance. And I say, what do you think? And they always say, oh gosh, it's going to be bloodbath. We got to stop it. We got to kind of slow down, whatever. And then I tell them I took the picture in Shanghai and ask, what do they think now? And so the answer on AI is like, you can not use it in an organization and like not get the benefits for safety, for wages, for whatever, and have other people get it, or you can figure out how to use AI as a complement for your job. And so because of these architectural frictions, all technology takes a long time. Like radiologists still doing fine. Translators, you might think translators is like the first thing to be killed. Like we basically have perfect translation. Translator employment is at an all-time high. What's happened is that we translate many more things than we used to. And there are a lot of like decisions beyond the like, what word should I use to mean public health that need to be made. And so the translators who don't use AI at all in their job are just absolutely getting crushed, but the people in the translation industry are actually doing better than they've ever done before. So this prediction that like we won't find useful things for people to do because of AI, like we're giving you like a magic technology that increases productivity a ton. Like it's just crazy to be pessimistic about how this is gonna affect your job, you know?
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on that, the consistent storyline is that no job is going to be fully automatable by AI right now. And so that is actually a really optimistic storyline. And I think aligning with Kevin's perspective, I think for us, especially in health and safety, where I think we're still kind of learning about how AI will impact our industry, I think there's a really good opportunity to think about the types of job tasks that are uniquely human, that we can really capitalize on and be unique from the AI, and then utilize AI to do everything else. There's, I think, a really good storyline about that. But what that will require is us to build literacy on AI, how it's developed, how to best and responsibly adopt it. How do we know that it's causing harm? I think these are areas that we need to really gain insight into in order to capitalize on its benefits. And I think through that lens, we will, I think this idea of mass disruptions won't play out. In fact, we'll become better health and safety professionals as a result of it.
So we have lots of questions coming in.
Lots of questions coming in.
Yeah, so this one, they put the caveat that the question was sponsored by AI. So as AI becomes more embedded in our workplaces, how can leaders remain attuned to the human experience of work, particularly around intensity, overload, and well-being? What early signs should they be looking for, and how can we better equip them to recognize and respond to these shifts in a tech-driven environment?
Definitely ChatGPT.
A lot of M dashes.
You push this to me. Wow, okay. That's a great question. I mean, so the chapter of the book that I'm writing is, the biggest chapter that really stands out is about the social. So when I ask people to imagine, or actually if it's gone, what did you miss? What would you miss most, or what did you miss most once the work vanished? And the number one answer in some way, shape, or form is the people. Not always. I mean, people say, always want it, beep. Bad bosses are a huge toxic drain. In fact, that's a big one. But the people element is really, really clear. See if I can answer this question, because there's a lot in there. But I'll just pick up on the human element there, that I think what you said sort of about literacy, AI literacy, I mean, that I would actually say, like, part of what I'm trying to get is a broader mindset shift about a literacy about work, a literacy about what we do. Like, this is what I do for a living. What does that mean, actually, in a broader? And I think the people element of, like, so, the way AI, is it a tool? I mean, again, something else you said that was really powerful was, like, almost kind of like, here I am working with this agent. I mean, you and I are working together, and there's social comparison processes like, wow, he's so much smarter. So we have insecurities, and then that's triggered in a team where somebody's better off. But if it's an agent that's AI, what is that gonna do? Because we can talk it through. But so your comment about that was fascinating for me, because it's like, at the end of the day, I think it's a question of how much it's going to disrupt what we do versus kind of augment. And I just, you guys probably have a better handle on that than I do. But I think there's a lot of variation on it. So a lot of the qualitative research sort of gets more at what you're talking about, is people are like, well, we're already using it to do this and this, but it'll never be able to do that. And then another person will be like, it's going to be, I'm going to be replaced in a few years. And so then the question is, what do they do? Anyway, I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, I guess if workplaces are looking to think about how to protect workers as they're adopting AI, a lot of our kind of OG perspectives on how to create psychologically and physically healthy and safe work environments are still consistent, right? And I think a mistake would be to adopt an AI tool without, and just letting it loose without considering how it'll impact workers within the work environment. So the desire to study the psychosocial work environment, the working conditions, it's still more relevant now because you all of a sudden have a new kind of aspect that is changing it. I think one thing that we haven't talked about as a group is the biases that can creep into AI based on the selection of data, the design of algorithms, the way that it's implemented. And kind of aligning with this concept of AI literacy, if you don't know how to spot where potential biases can emerge, you're opening yourself up to a number of health and safety risks or a number of equity risks. And there have been numerous case studies of AI being adopted at work without taking an equity perspective, biasing different groups of people who have been historically disadvantaged, and as a result, causing a lot of harm. And so without us kind of being critical about AI adoption, how it's going to impact our work environment and different groups of workers, we stand to kind of perpetuate those types of disadvantages or harms. And so that is just, I guess, something to think about as people move forward on in this journey.
Yeah, and just real quick, I would say it's very hard to predict for technology like this how people will react. So creating like a workplace that, as a boss, that your employees enjoy and get meaning from is super important. But for example, there's studies that are showing, kind of surprisingly, that a lot of people prefer to talk to a workplace therapist that's not a person, that's an AI, because they find they're able to like help them think through problems, but it's like, I don't want to kind of say things that are embarrassing or whatever to a person. So like what type of tasks are the kinds that give people meaning and what don't? Like on the other hand, for example, something like if I was at a factory, we can do this today. I mean, there's companies selling this, but I would throw up video cameras looking at every single worker on the line. I got Arif's like my top worker and puts the wrench here instead of here, and the new employee who's less productive, I'd want pop on their screen or in their ear, like actually, try to do it this way. Normally, we'd have to train people over a year or 2 years to do that, whether it's just productivity or safety issues. Like that's doable today. I suspect you'll get more pushback on setting up the video cameras than you would on using like AI therapists for workplace injury. And I say that with like 50% confidence because it's just so hard to predict. And so this is going to be a lot of work for organizations to figure out how to create meaning. Like just making assumptions about how people will use AI and feel about AI I think is a mistake.
And then just to add to that, because I think it's an important point, if the person now feels like they are just a cog in the system as the machine would be, I think that is dehumanizing the worker. And that's a risk when we start implementing these types of technologies. And it kind of aligns with it. Like if you just feel like you're being overly surveilled, overly manipulated, and now the AI is also manipulating you, it totally like removes the human aspect of work. And I think these are things that I don't think we're understanding or studying enough. And this is kind of where the research imperative is growing.
So the next question is, there has been evidence recently published that the use of AI is leading to cognitive decline in humans. From your research, do you think that this is a risk factor from a health and safety perspective?
Yeah, so I'll start on this one. So this is very much related to this issue of architectural change. If you do not change anything about how your workplace works, like to take one worker, we call them like students. If I don't change anything about how I teach my class, the students are going to cheat up the wazoo and not learn anything. Yeah. Okay? And this absolutely is happening. This does not mean, at universities, high schools, everything, it does not mean that it's impossible to structure education in a way that incentivizes people to learn. But if you give people a tool that makes it trivial to get an A and cheat all day, and I don't change anything, then they're going to cheat all day. So like when I worry about cognitive decline, like, it's because I'm structuring what I ask the workers to do and how I ask them to learn in a way that the best way for them to advance in the organization and their career and other is to not learn anything. So, like, I hate it when people blame the worker or the student. Don't blame them. It's our fault. Like, we're the ones who set the rules. Like, this is a completely solvable problem.
I'm going to blame the students. No, I'm kidding. So I teach a class. I mean, I'm going to answer this more I don't study cognitive decline. However, one of the fundamental pillars of what makes work human is learning. And so all the idioms we have, like learning the hard way, learning on the fly, thinking outside the box. I mean, those are all rich interpersonal connections. But I teach a class with 700 intro students. And I've never seen anything like this. I've been teaching since the 90s. 700 students in Con Hall at U of T. And basically it's an arms race. I'm like, I can't assign papers. We were talking about this. I can't assign papers anymore. Think about that. Like learning and reading and synthesizing and sitting. I used to go to the library and sit with the stacks and like all gone. I mean, maybe we could have a debate about this, but I'm exhausted talking about stress. Like I can't keep up. Like what am I doing? But right in front of me in the class, like I gave a quiz and I've got 9 TAs, but we got a small army of TAs. And they're like, about half of the class are opening up your quiz, throwing it into ChatGPT. And so talk about demoralizing and dehumanizing, because okay, well, what, and so I have to constantly think about ways to and you know what, honestly, one of my colleagues, just go back old school and have them write. They can't handwrite anymore. I'm not joking, sorry, but I would just say, just the last point on that, fundamentally though, to answer the question about the human and meaning side, I do think that learning is fundamental to core elements of the self. And I think there's a lot on managers these days to also kind of try to figure out what self-esteem, mastery, efficacy, feeling like you matter are fundamental, and learning is fundamental to that. So I do think cognitive decline, I think that was already in place to be honest, with phones and scrolling, but I think this poses another threat and to a whole sector for education. I mean, it's a whole other basket of problems.
So just real quick before leaving the education sector, at work, the one thing I would be most concerned about is that junior employees tend to learn through osmosis, basically. So they're not good at their job. They're around people who are better at their job. Mm-hmm. They learn. It is actually a huge problem that we really, because the junior employees are not good at their job, if we don't need to rely on them, we won't. And so previously we didn't need formal structures in many fields for how do you get the junior people to learn better. If I was a manager 2025, I would start implementing part of the promotions for middle managers involve how much training you're doing for people lower down. Previously you didn't do that because it was just implied, but it needs to be formalized now. And those are the type of architectural changes that I think a lot of organizations will struggle with, and they will see problems for their junior employees.
So if I can just make one comment on this question as well, to put in a little bit of perspective for all of us, in 470 BC, Socrates said the following: I admonish the written word. I argue that the act of encoding information in this way weakens our memories.
What did he know?
What did he know exactly? However, it's relevant to the question, and it's relevant to the answers on the panel, saying the pen and paper reduced cognitive decline.
Yeah.
That's in essence what that's saying. So, okay.
It's the synthesizing and organizing and structuring it. Yeah, it's not just the right. Anyway.
Okay, do we have time for one more question? Or?
Absolutely. One
Okay.
more.
So as we look ahead to the next 5 or 10 years, based on what you know about AI's capabilities and where they might be going, how do you envision AI transforming the way that home and community healthcare organizations deliver care, particularly in enhancing patient outcomes, supporting care workers, and addressing systemic challenges such as workforce shortages or care coordination?
Yeah, okay, so Arf will give you a better answer, but I just last week was working with literally this question. We're planning the biggest hospital in Canada being built right now that will open in 5 to 10 years from now. So their concern is that people are like getting healthcare in the hallways. We don't have enough workers to do a lot of the stuff. Obviously, the population's getting older, things like dementia. We literally do not have enough people to do these tasks. So interesting, there is actually some interesting research on this. 5 to 10 years might be a little soon, but the question of like to what extent robotics can be helpful for home healthcare, there's a ton of work going into this on the engineering side and on the social science side. I think most people are under the impression that there's a lot of like kind of either embarrassing or physically challenging tasks involved in home healthcare that go beyond just the kind of emotional support. And the more we can move that to using machines, the better. Previously, there's just nothing we could do. You needed to like, help lift a person off a bed. And so I think that's the kind of thing where you'll get very little over the next 5 years. But if what people out in Silicon Valley think will happen on the robotics side, we've seen really, really amazing advances in robotics the last couple of years, happen, then we will be able to solve some of the more physically demanding labor shortages in this field. And it's really essential. Like Canada's a little luckier compared to like Europe or East Asia, but the population is getting older very, very, very rapidly in some countries. And it's not totally obvious how we're supposed to handle some of the needs we'll face.
Yeah, so we're working with a number of healthcare organizations as well, and from like a clinical outcomes perspective, anecdotally they're seeing a lot of benefits about utilizing AI tools. But that's not an area that I know a lot about. But what I do understand is, or what I am seeing, is that there's actually very little data showing how workers are engaging with AI. In terms of how it's impacting their work environments from a health and safety perspective, how it's impacting their jobs. I think there's a lot of fear amongst healthcare professionals that in terms of job disruption, there's also a lot of strain on healthcare professionals. So adopting new types of AI tools is a source of stress for them. So I think that's kind of themes that are popping up, but there's actually very little data. And that's what some of the work that we plan to do moving forward is actually go into healthcare settings and understand how they're interacting with these tools, how it's impacting their health and safety. But Kevin's kind of talking about a world where these types of technologies are commonplace, and he's saying maybe 5 to 10 years, but like maybe not. And so, but like who's doing the most physical and unpredictable tasks right now? Typically like care aides, people who are kind of newcomers, who are racialized, often women. And during the pandemic, these were the most vulnerable groups of workers. They were put in the most unsafe situations. And I don't think AI is going to benefit their working lives. So like these are the kind of like the most, the highest need group. And I don't believe right now or in the next 5 or 10 years that AI is going to make their lives better. But is it possible? Hopefully, and hopefully the innovations that Kevin's seeing in Silicon Valley will trickle down into the community and help those folks. So I think just it's kind of to summarize that, there's actually a lack of data, and I guess the fear is the most needed individuals will be excluded from these AI innovations.
You see, the important thing here, though, is that this sector AI rollout is relatively slow, and we're saying it's bad. Like, it's bad for the people's working lives, it's bad for their safety, and it's bad for their productivity. Like, it would be much better if we could tell you in, like, home health aides in 10 years will not be hurting their back lifting someone up. Right? So that's the problem with some of this like AI doomerism. Like a lot of people have aspects of their job, like the wages aren't high enough, they're not productive enough, it's unsafe. And AI tools and robotics are gonna be very useful in a lot of those areas. And things that slow down the adoption or frictions to adopting AI, in many cases are bad, not good.
But that's where leadership plays a significant role. Like we need to have folks who have more power over these types of decisions to identify the groups of workers that need these types of innovations the most and funnel the innovations towards them. But if we're not doing that, it's just going to kind of widen the inequity that we already know that exists in our labor market.
Great. So to just finalize this part, thanks so much for the three of you, particularly, I know a riff, but for Scott and Kevin, just to pick up the phone, some random call from some random organization who's trying to help health and safety. So I just can't thank you enough for taking the time here today. and spending some time with me before the meeting and hopefully after this as well. Very much appreciated. I'm sure there's many more questions that we didn't get to. High level of interest in this. The diversity of thought is appreciated and understood. The one message I take from this is there's lots of health and safety work to be done based on AI going into the workforce, both physically and psychologically. So that could be a positive for PSHSA as well.